And good afternoon, everyone. It is 2 o'clock on a beautiful Tuesday afternoon. We got great weather here in Houston in April, and we are continuing on our series of measurement educational videos. Specifically, we're focusing on the FlowX. I am Brent Palmer. I'm with CRT Services, and I am the Manager of Measurement Technology. And I'm here to teach you a little bit about the FlowX, and our title today is going to be on historical data. And we'll go over a brief description of what historical data is, but I'd like to start off just by thanking everyone for coming. And if you at any time have any questions during the course of this presentation, please put them up in the chat, or at the end, unmute your microphone and ask any questions that you have. Or as always, you can email us, and if we don't know the answer, we'll make sure that we can find somebody who can answer the questions that you have. If you've got any other suggestions for video topics, please let us know. Keep on checking back to our website and also to our shared calendar. That's where you'll find all the new topics that are coming up, new schedules, and also the links to the videos that we're recording for this and other topics as they come along. So we'll go ahead and get started. We're going to talk today about FlowX historical data and what that means. So let's get done with our PowerPoint presentation here and get right into Flow Express, and specifically what we're going to do with the information in historical data. So the Flow computer, like most Flow computers, has a ton of data that we need to get out of it. Now, typically the way that we've done that is we either pull Modbus registers or we'll get our information off of reports. So let's just do an example of what we would get from a report. I'm going to go ahead and log into one of the FlowXs that I have here at the corporate headquarters of CRT Services in lovely Humble, Texas. And I'm going to go ahead and log in. And let's say that I want to get a meter report. I want to get a batch that just went through, or a historical batch. And typically what I would do is I would go into reports, and I would go into the meter run, and I would look to see if I have any meter tickets in there. So I've got a few meter tickets that have been created. I'll go ahead and click on one of the meter tickets, and we have the information from this meter ticket. So it's got batch numbers, batch IDs, the API table versions. Now, API has a requirement for a quantity transaction record of what must be on it. And our records meet that quantity transaction record requirement. But it only lists a few bits of information. There's so much more information that we can have available to us when these batches occur, or when hours occur, or periods of time, or events. The difficulty is trying to get the information out of the device, because there can be so much information. I either have to map them all to Modbus registers, or if I'm putting them onto a report, somebody has to get this report, or they have to pull this report in, and they have to use a program that will then take this report and do what we call parsing out the information. So they have to know that the data they're actually looking for is this little piece right here, and this is the descriptor of that data, but they don't really care about that. What they care about is what line number on this report and how many spaces over is the data that they actually need to parse out, or the number they need to parse out. So it's text parsing, as we called it. And it's just another way of getting data off of a report, but it's not really the most efficient. And obviously you can see where a lot of things can happen in trying to pull this data out. So we've all heard of databases, SQL databases, MySQL, SQLite databases. So there's many different kinds of databases. And one of the things we've done within the FlowX is, in addition to reports like this, when an event happens or when a period happens, you can set up a archive, or a historical archive, or a historical database, depending on how you want to call it. And you can save that information inside the Flow computer for retrieval later. So the FlowX has the ability to create custom historical data maps, or historical data archives. You're able to create custom triggers, or use some of the existing triggers that are in there, and capture tags of data at that moment in time when this event happened. So in the case of a batch, if I want to capture the batch information that happened when I perform a batch end, what I'm capturing is the previous information. So everything I'm normally going to capture is what happened in the batch that just ended. So I hit a batch end, I have a flag that goes up. When I see that flag, I actually start capturing the data off of the device, and I put it into this SQL database. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to show you how these databases are derived and how they're developed, and then how they're put into the FlowX, and then how we can get information back out of them. So let's go ahead and close this report up. And with Flow Express open, we're going to go ahead and I'm going to connect to a Flow computer, and I'm going to read the application from this Flow computer. So in this case, we're going to go into the one we were just in, which is 201, and I'll hit next, and it will go in and retrieve the application along with the parameters and some other information. I'll put in my password, and then we will go through. I might freeze here for a second because we're going to go ahead and compile this application and open it up. And while it's doing that, what it's doing is it's verifying for problems within the application, problems within the parameters, problems within something going on in the Flow computer. But basically, we're just reading the program that's inside of it, along with the firmware, the reports, the displays, and how everything was configured. So that'll open up here in 1 second. And if I look on my navigation panel on the left-hand side, you'll see that I have a section that's called Historical Data. Now, if you're using the older version of Flow Express, anything below 3.0, the historical data will not be here. You'll have to go into the professional mode to gain access to the historical data. With Flow Express 3.0 and above, you're now able to gain access by staying in the basic mode. So I'm just going to click on Historical Data. And what you'll see is in this application, we have 2 historical databases that are set up, one for the batch and one for the daily. I'll put my glasses on so I can see a little bit better. So in our Flow computer, we have what we call the US Liquids Archive. And by default, coming with the application, you'll have a batch and you'll have a daily. Now there's a little reoccurring circle that are on both of these. When we have multiple modules inside the Flow computer, you can create multiple displays that recreate themselves for each module that's installed. So I don't have to go in and say, well, go get module 1's run viscosity daily average. I can just say, go to the LU run and get viscosity daily average. And if I create this archive as reoccurring, it knows for every time we put another module in the FlowX and create a multiple module FlowX, it will create another archive specifically for module 2, and then for module 3 and module 4. So I don't have to keep on making these. I just have to say that the one I've created is reoccurring. So when we break down what this archive actually is, we have, in this case, a batch, and it can be called anything that you want. We'll call it a batch because we're going to capture batch information. It's reoccurring. You can either right-click on it to tell it it's reoccurring, or you can come over here and say it's reoccurring. And you'll see that we had that red light come up because we have a little problem with the, if I uncheck reoccurring, it doesn't like that. So that's an error within the system, basically saying, hey, I need to know if this is mod 1, mod 2, or so forth. But when I keep it reoccurring, it lets everything be good. Now, what's the trigger on this? Is it a batch? A batch is a movement of product. It doesn't have to be a specific time, so a 24-hour, they're period data. A batch is basically the start of a movement, the end of a movement. It could have ran for minutes, it could have ran for months, but it's the start, the end, and the total count and averages of the flow rates, temperatures, pressures, meter factors, and so forth that are inside that batch. So what we're going to do is we're going to stay with batch, but you can say I have some other options. Period. Period would be period, hour, minute, months. We have some period of data that you can set up yourself. It's called period A and period B, where we'll do flow-weighted averaging and totals for user-defined period, and you define whether that period is a second, a minute, an hour, a day, a month, a year, a quarter. And then you can bring that information in and store it in an archive or put it on a report. One of the reasons you may want to do that is some people, their systems, their day runs from midnight to midnight. So I want to know how much flow I had across my system in a day from midnight to midnight. But my customer's day may not be from midnight to midnight. It may be from 6 a.m. to 6 a.m. And they want to see what their flow rate was, what their totals were for that 6 a.m. to 6 a.m. period. Now, when flow's coming across the pipe, it obviously can be all over the place as far as flow rates go and temperature and pressure and density. So one of the things we can do is we can set up internally. The FlowX has a daily set of registers and flow weighted averages, but we also have those other two periods, period A and period B. So I could set up a period archive and also set the period up to be a day, and that day would run from 6 a.m. to 6 a.m. And then I would just capture the period A information for totalizers and flow weighted averages and so forth. Here, we're just going to stay simplistically with a batch, which is a batch, and then a daily, which is a period, but there's a period within the FlowX called the day. So with the batch, you have some functions that you can trigger this on. So again, what I'm looking for is something to happen in the FlowX. In this case, it's going to be a batch end or a batch archive. We're going to see a flag, and when that happens, I'm going to capture certain information. So what I'm going to capture is, I'm going to capture my trigger first there's a trigger in there that's called batch archive. That basically, when this trigger happens, we're going to trigger and capture this archive data at that moment in time. We created these triggers to make sure that we had a way to, outside of a batch flag, to actually capture data. So we can turn this archive on and off on capturing data simply by doing a web selection. So if I say batch archive module, that gives me the ability to go into the web interface and go into configuration in overall setup in our common settings. And we have some settings in here to turn on and off this capture of the historical. So basically, if I was to turn off generate batch loading archive data, because my trigger requires that I have both a batch end flag and that parameter is enabled, I can turn off the capture of this, and I don't have to needlessly capture a lot of data inside the flow computer. So I can turn them on or off. Now, if I want to trigger it on something else, I can do it off approve. I can do it off sampling can batches that we may have inside. There's also stability sample times there, and you can create your own custom triggers. Couldn't get the word out of my head. Custom triggers to be able to capture this information. And we'll do that in a later session. This is meant more to be how we can do that within the U.S. Liquids Archive and what these values actually mean. So we're going to capture it off a batch archive. The next thing is we have a selection for keep data for max. So we have a gigabyte of internal storage inside the FlowX. And what that does is it allows you to store a lot of information, but I may not want to store a ton of how much data do I actually need to store inside here. Well, with the FlowX, what we typically recommend is to not keep it for a max, but to keep it for a number of days. So if I'm keeping batch information, I can set it up. I want to keep the next 365 days of information. Why don't we want to keep it for a max or a max size? Because the max size at times, it goes in and it has to recalculate every time it creates a new batch. And if we're doing a lot of batches, it has to recalculate how much space that it has in order to kick something out and retain this information. And on older FlowXs, this created a little bit of a memory issue depending on the amount of data that you had stored inside the flow computer. So what we recommend is if you set it for days, you won't run into a problem with that. The other thing we want to do is we want to set the storage system to our SQLite database storage system. Now, there are a couple options for old style and default. They're going to be removed out. Keep it in SQLite database storage systems, and I'll explain to you how we do that, what it looks like here in a few minutes. The last thing we have is there's an old style of Enron archives that are retrieved via Modbus, and you have the ability, if you're going to be retrieving this data using the Enron raw data archive structure, you can set in the maximum number of records that you want to store within the flow computer. So even though I'm keeping 365 days worth of batches, I'm only going to keep a maximum of 64 Modbus records of this data. And Modbus is also limited to this record can only capture 254 bits of data. So there's a limit of how much data I can actually have in one transaction record. So one transaction record is a batch end, a meter ticket. So there's only so much I can capture. So on a Modbus, I may be able to capture 30 points of data, but in this SQL database, I'm able to capture much more data. So the data that I'm capturing is tags. The FlowX is a tag-based system, and I have these tags that I want to capture. So if I have a database that's already capturing this batch information, what if I wanted to see more information? How do I add it into the database? Well, we do just like I did. I read the application from the FlowX. I can see what the existing database looks like. And at the end, I can just start putting in more data that I want. So if it was some other information I wanted to capture at that moment in time, like let's say down here, the analog input, the current raw value, I can simply grab that data, drag it, and put it in there. And then I go ahead and I write the application back down to the flow computer. I'm going to go ahead and take that out. What if I wanted to just create a smaller database? I don't need all this information. I just need some data. Well, I can go up top. I can say create a new archive. I can call it Brent's archive. We'll call it Brent. I'll make it reoccurring. I'll make it for a batch, and I'm going to make it for the batch archive. And I can go back to that batch and just highlight some of the information I may want. I want the start dates, start times, the API tables, and copy and paste that in. I can also open up another application that may have a database that I want, and I cannot copy the whole database, but what I can do is create the name of it and then copy everything that is within that database to another FlowExpress application by simply hitting copy and then opening the other application, coming into where I want to copy it to, and then paste it in there. And these are just tags that are within the system. There's not a limit really to the number of tags you can put in there, but obviously the more tags you put in, the higher the data count's going to be. So capture what you need, don't necessarily capture. Now we have systems that are set up that have 40 to 50 different databases that are triggering at different times. The other thing, we have our daily. Now in this one, it's an SQL-like database, but now I'm triggering off the daily information, and I'm capturing the tags out of the flow computer that are referencing the day. So in this case, I'm capturing on the LU run sheet, there's the relative density at 60 degrees. The DY stands for day, average, in the forward direction. And again, most information that I'm looking for is going to be previous information. So if the days ended, I trigger to capture information, but I need to see the information from yesterday to put it into an archive to save, because today's information I'm still gathering. So a lot of times I'm looking for tags that are previous. They are already happened, as where if I wanted, let's say, what's going on right now, I would change the PRV in this tag to CUR, and that would give me the current information. And I could write this down. You also have the ability, if I wanted to change the tags in here from current to previous, I also have the ability to go up, and you'll see some binoculars up there, and I can change and say, I want to change everything in here from PRV to _CUR. So everything in this one archive, and it says look in the selected archive, go ahead and replace. So it changed those 42 tags from the previous values to the current, and now I could capture current information. Now, if I see something that is red like this, when I go to compile, it's going to create an error. And that's because these tags don't exist, or the tag formatting is not right, the tag name is not right. For these, I can either look for the proper tag and tag spelling down here in the search, or I can delete those out and just say I don't need them. The last thing I need to do is, if I've created a new archive, I need to display that if I want to see it through the web interface. And what I mean by that is, if I go into the web interfaces in the FlowX, you'll see we have one for historical data. When I click on historical data and go to batch, the batch tags are in here. All those tags that were created along with the values, I can just pull them up via the web interface if I want to see what the information was when it was captured. Now you'll see that I have more in my reports. I have more meter tickets than I do of my historical batch data. That's because I didn't turn on that triggering, so it didn't trigger grabbing the batch information. So I'll go back real quick to Flow Express, and I need to go into my display and come underneath that display for historical data in the run, and you can see the runs reoccurring. And I'm going to click on Run, right click, and I'm going to say a new historical data display. And now I can call this Brent. And I'll grab the template that I want, which is that historical database that I just named Brent. And that's it. Once I write this to the Flow computer, every time a Brent archive is triggered, I'll be able to look at it here. Sounds great. So now we got all this information. What do we do with it? Why do we capture it this way? Well, if I wanted to get information out of the Flow computer via Modbus again, I have to create a Modbus mapping. So in the Flow computer, let's take a look at a Modbus mapping that we may have within here. And we'll go to one that's pretty common on Omni version 20. So let's look at a totalizer. And we'll go down, the totalizers are in, they save them in by meters. So we'll go to 5101. So that's going to give me my current gross, net, mass, energy, gross total, cumulative. And then I have to, if I want the meters previous batch, I have to pull in registers 5101. And if I leave them out, and I've got to do a long pull inside here. But I set up that historical data to get the information and just capture it in the tags. So I don't have to worry about whether it's a long or a short, how many bits it is, what register it's in. What I really care about is what is the tag and what's the value of the tag. So instead of having to open up a Modbus poller and then try to connect into a device, so we'll disconnect, we'll connect in, and then I want to poll these registers. We said 5101. I'm going to poll them, and they are 32-bit registers, but they're integers. They're not floats, so I have to make sure I know that they're that way. And then I hit send, and that's great. I've got data. But what's the data? Well, it's 1028, it's 4398, but what does that data actually mean? Well, I have to know on this side what I just polled for, and I have to put it in somewhere over on this side. With the database, what I'm able to do is just with web service commands, I'm able to get the information out of the Flow computer, and I'm able to do it more efficiently. I'm not always polling for all of these registers to see when something changes. I'm polling for a status bit, and I'm looking at a checksum value. And when that checksum value changes, I know to ask for a different request to get all my information back. So what the backend systems are doing with our native driver is, instead of going in and saying, hey, give me, we're going to go to 101, instead of doing it by Modbus, what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask for a command that's called Snapshots. And what Snapshots does is it gives me the information back with a unique identifier and a timestamp and the date, the name, this is the Mod1 daily archive, our serial number, so I know what device it came from, and then the information that is contained in that archive, Mod1, LU run, the API observed density, daily average, and the forward previous, and here's my value. And that information is able to be put into different systems, but it's also able to be put into an SQL database, and it's in a database inside the FlowX. Now this is from 326. So the FlowX initially is giving me the oldest records first, but if I do something as simple as changing the way that I ask for my query, and I say filter equals ascending equals 0, now what it does is it will give me back the newest, which is still 326. So really didn't do anything that different, but what it's doing is this is the way it's saved in those new SQL style databases. But I'm still able to go in with a web query and ask it, without having the software, what do those archives look like? So that archive inside the FlowX that has mod1 batch, you can see that it has sys location. If I look back at my application, and I'll go back to the basic mode, in my historical data and my batch record, sys location. So that's the value that it's giving me back. And I can see the way that this is set up in the archive and all the tags that are inside of it. And the same way with the daily, sys location. Now, Brent isn't in there because I didn't write the application. But again, if I ask for those snapshots, it's going to bring me back the information. And what's the first real bit of tag that it brings me back is that sys location. So it gives me the system name, Bakken, and also a system tag, and then our LU run and all that other information. The other thing that we do is we have a little Excel add-in that you can put in, and I'll open up Excel real quick. So when I open up Excel and I use my Flow Extract add-in, I can actually put in a Flow computer. I'll put in the IP address here, save it, and I'll reconnect to it. And now I can go look at those archives. It's asking me for a username. And here's the two archives we have in here. I can select a period of time that I want to retrieve those archives from, or I can just say, give me from the start date to the most recent, which is 3/16, and I hit extract. And what it's going to do is it's going to bring back those tag names, sys location, and for record number 1, this is what it was, and for record number 2, this is what it was. And basically, if I have 100 records in there or 300 records, it's going to bring back all those records and all the tag values and bring them back and put them in Excel for me. So these are my batch reports. Or if I go get, these are my batch archives. If I go get my daily archives, I may not have any daily archives. Well, I have one. So it brings back my daily archives. But also those physical meter reports, I can go into reports and collect meter tickets and say extract. And then it's going to bring them back and it's going to put them inside of a folder for me. And then I can pull up the meter tickets and have them in text. So it's a quick, easy way to get information out as long as I have the FlowX set up correctly. And it's a tool that's called Flow Extract. And it's an add-on to Excel. And you can find it by going to our little download section at CRT. And there'll be a link for that. But inside of there, we have the latest version of Flow Express, along with archived versions of Flow Express. And you'll also find tools. And in the tools, there is a little Flow Extract. You'll also see there are other tools that we'll go over on doing FlowX monitoring, FlowX Extra, how to update manuals, how to read a specific tag out. And we're going to go over read tags in another module where we do web services specifically. But this was just a general overview of our archives and how to use historical data within the FlowX. And if you have any questions, please let me know. I'll wait for a few seconds to see if anybody's got any pop-up questions they want to ask. Or unmute your mic. All right, perfect. It is beautiful outside, so if you get a chance, get outside today, stretch your legs, enjoy the good weather while we have it, and we just hope everybody has a good day and hope you come back for the next video that we'll be doing, which I believe is sometime tomorrow. And again, if you have any questions, please get a hold of us at CRT Services, and we just thank you for your time today.